I feel like I'm going to cry. You're listening to The Artist Athlete, episode 100. This podcast is dedicated to Circus. It's a place for professionals in the industry to share their stories, viewpoints, and information, and a place for outsiders to get a sneak peek into this world. I have said that 100 times. I'm Shannon McKenna. I'm the host of the Artist Athlete podcast, and I am like freaking out right now because if you had told me 3 years ago when I started this podcast that I would be doing episode 100 and I would have figured out a way to get Victor Fomine, the legendary swinging trapeze coach, as my guest, and I would have been able to raise the money to get an amazing translator, an amazing editor, have a whole team behind me and a whole community behind them to make this podcast happen, I probably would have told you that you were absolutely insane because I was an old lady like harvesting bees somewhere or something and had given up on all of this a long time ago. So gosh, thank you all who are listening right now. Thank you for tuning in this week and every week to hear amazing stories about this art form that I love and that I'm sure you love too if you're listening to this. I'm like trying to keep it together. I had no idea that I would get so emotional recording this intro. Yeah, I don't want to talk too much about myself because while I made this podcast is really, as I say in the intro, dedicated to Circus. It's dedicated to the community that I love so much. I want to read out the names of some of the people in this community who helped support this episode specifically. So Ali B, Simone LJ, Sheer, Tasha GH, Laura H, Deanna, Renelle K, Sylvie, Virginia Elster C, Kim J, Jessica B, Carl A, Sarah, Jenny F, Anna S, Megan S, Rianne H, Avi PN, Nif, Christy P, Nicole B, Rachel S, Heather, Dwara GS, Courtney D, Laura E, Samson S, Cheryl W, Hannah, Jackie S, Eric M, hey Eric, Nicholas C, Alyssa F, Anya C, Cynthia P, Jane H, and Mary O, and to all the anonymous donors who did not want their name read but still contributed to this episode. Thank you. And as always, thank you to my Patreons for your ongoing support. You guys are the reason that I continue to make this, even though sometimes I really, really don't want to, or I really feel like nobody cares about it. Gosh, thank you all. Patreon.com/theartistathlete is the place that you want to go if you want to support getting to another 100 episodes. We have a ton more guests in store after this one. And so we're just going to keep going. This podcast has really gotten me through 2020. Just creating it for you guys has been an anchor for me in a lot of ways. And when I had to take breaks, it really sucked. And when I came back, even though my guests and I didn't really want to talk about Circus at points, it was so nourishing for us to just have this conversation about this art form that we all believe in and have trained so hard and fought so hard to be a part of. And I hope that by listening, you all feel as empowered and emboldened as I do creating these episodes. That's all I want to say. Just thank you again. Let's get to the man of the episode, Victor Fomine. So there are biographies of Victor all over the internet. Circopedia has a very long and very intensely written biography that if you have a chance to go to circopedia.com or just search Victor Fomine, you'll find it. And it's very long. I won't be reading that one. I will be reading one from the École Nationale du Cirque. So it says, primarily a circus artist, Victor began his teaching career in 1983 at the Moscow State Circus School before moving on to teach aerial disciplines at the Annie Fratellini Academy in France. He served as a trainer at Cirque du Soleil since 1993 and specializes in the teaching of the flying trapeze. This is clearly translated from French. Recognized throughout the world for his mastery of the discipline and the quality of his teaching, Victor has trained dozens of circus artists and specialists in flying trapeze. Many of his former students have won awards at some of the most prestigious competitions, including the Festival Mondial du Cirque du Soleil in Paris and the Wugao International Festival of China. Now, Victor speaks French and Russian, and obviously this podcast is in English. So in order to bring Victor's story to you in as close to his own words as possible, I sat down with him and a Russian translator, and we were all socially distanced, and we recorded the episode. So I would ask a question, the translator would translate, and then Victor would answer, and then the translator would translate that, and then I would listen to it, and then I would ask the next question, and it went on like that. Obviously, that doesn't make for a very good podcast. So then my amazing editor, Allison, went in with another translator, picked it all apart and put it all back together so it becomes the story that you are listening to right now. So in addition to all of the other people, I want to thank all of the listeners for making this happen. I also want to say thank you to my team for the hours and hours of work you spent on this episode. Guys, we are not NPR. We are not This American Life. We do not have the kind of budget, the time, the equipment that those people have. So the fact that we made this makes me so proud and just so in awe of my team. As a result, there are, some translation issues. There are some things that Marina doesn't know, like, for example, Alegria, not Allegri, is the name of the show. But overall, you're going to get a very good look at Victor's story. And I'm going to stop talking so we can listen to it. Here is episode 100, my interview with Victor Fomine. Foma. I still really I don't know how to say his last name. I'm just going to admit that right now. I'm an acrobat, not a journalist. Fomine. Okay, here you go. So to start, I'd just say who you are and what you do. Introduce yourself.
Меня зовут Фомин Виктор.
My name is Victor Fomine.
Я являюсь педагогом Монреальской цирковой школы. Также работаю по приглашению в Cirque du Soleil.
I teach at the Montreal Circus School, as well as coaching part-time at Cirque du Soleil.
Раньше отработал
I used to work there full-time for 20 years, non-stop, back when they did formations, but I don't anymore. And I also own my own studio, which will turn 20 next year.
Основные дисциплины, которые я преподаю, это, конечно, трапеция.
Well, the main disciplines I teach, as you know, are swinging trapeze, swinging rope and belts. And in addition, for Cirque du Soleil, I taught high bar for Corteo and aerial bars for Mystère and Allegri. I had taught solely high bar for 10 years straight and has recently been asked actually to do it again for Allegri, but I had to decline. My shoulders are no longer able to withstand such pressure.
Swinging trapeze is easier on the shoulders?
It's a completely different type of work, much easier. Trapeze has more or less the same swing distance on either side, so should the gymnast fall, they fall for 1-2 meters. And on a high bar, you can go up as high as 12 meters. Therefore, I would need to catch someone who is in free fall already for a good 4-5 meters, with their mass increasing as they pick up speed, and that is obviously an immense force on the shoulders. Of course, I have to hold them, so they do have the net underneath them. The trick is to fall into it in a particular way, in the correct way, because you can get seriously injured even when hitting the net. That's why the first thing to learn on a high bar is not the elements, it is to learn to fall and land.
How do you practice that?
It is a gradual process. First, they and I jump together and I get hold of them just as they're about to hit the net, which lets me see if they're flying correctly. Then, after repeatedly working with the launcher, and when I see I no longer have to hold them, when they're able to fly well, Only then I removed the longe.
Did you start on high bar in Russia?
The high bar that I did for cartel, that type of bar, is actually a number I'd personally created while working in the Moscow Circus. It's the only number that was performed here, which I myself had created.
So, real quick about Circus in the Soviet Union where Victor grew up. You know, just for some context, in 1929, the Soviet Union created the Moscow Circus School, making it the first country in the world to operate a circus training facility that was state-funded. That means the government gave them a bunch of money to do circus. So yeah, it was kind of a big deal. Circus was a super big deal, actually. At the height of the Soviet circus's popularity in the 1980s, 1,000 students would audition for just 70 spots in the school. And being a circus artist was full of benefits like guaranteed retirement, better housing, childcare, maternity leave, and the ability to travel internationally. Also, in Russia during the Soviet Union, and to this day, it's mandatory for men to serve in the army for at least a year. And those facts about the circus and the army seem unrelated, but the whole thing is going to make a whole lot more sense in about 3 minutes. So let's get back to the interview. Okay. Yeah, I know a lot about your coaching, but I don't know a lot about your performing career or anything before that. Can you talk a little bit about what you did before you were the one pulling all the time?
I ended up at a circus by complete chance. I was finishing my army service at the CSKA in Moscow. And just by the end of my career as a gymnast, when I was still in high school, I had made it into the Russian national gymnastics team. But it was just before my graduation, so I could no longer be a high school gymnast. And so I took a gap year between the end of school and enlisting for army service. By that time, I was already a candidate master of sports in artistic gymnastics. And that was the year I was invited to work as a coach for beginner gymnasts in the same club I had trained in. I also entered Moscow Power Engineering Institute at part-time for evening classes. So I would do coaching in the morning, train myself in the afternoon, because I figured I'd have to continue doing gymnastics during service. Or actually, I'd been told that's what I might do. And attend lectures in the evening. The university's department was in my hometown of Podolsk, just outside Moscow. And sometimes I would even make it to a disco at 10 p.m. after everything. So I did that course for a year, while in the same year teaching gymnastics, and then enlisted in the army. After giving the pledge, I was transferred to the CSKA, which is the Central Sports Army Club in Moscow. And a year after, I was transferred to Dynamo. I mean, these were the two most prominent, most famous gymnastics clubs, not only in Russia, but in the entire Soviet Union. And thanks to training twice daily, Mondays being the only days off, for 2 years, I received a very strong acrobatic basics and, vision for elements. Truly, there were a lot of training sessions, which is where I got very strong fundamentals and the ability to visualize acrobatic elements in air, just all due to the sheer number of training sessions.
How did you find circus from the army?
Upon completing the 2 years of army service, I was actually asked to stay for one more, but frankly, that job didn't give me much freedom. It wasn't exactly like you were in prison, but you were always following someone's orders. So I just decided not to remain there, but to go back to teaching in my old place, in my old club. And what happened then was that during one of the training sessions, a man whom I didn't know back then but who is now my very close friend, invited me to come to the Moscow Circus and do a number on high bar.
And you were just like, yeah, why not? Circus?
I had actually planned on going back to my part-time studies, but the student stipend in those days was 30 rubles, and depending financially on my parents for 5 more years was just not an option, especially since I also had a younger brother who was still at school. So I figured it would be best if I continued studying and then could maybe send some of my stipend money to my family, because my parents were regular workers and they didn't earn much and frankly were in debt quite a bit. So yeah, that financial situation has played a part in my decision, because joining the circus gave me a monthly salary of 250 rubles. So yeah, a bit of a difference between that and the 30 rubles student stipend. I mean, we could do tricks, no problem, but we had no choreo experience. You had to be an artist to do that. And at first, I couldn't even find my way around the entrances and the exits of the circus arena. It was round and had 4 exits. We had no idea how to leave the stage, how to bow to the public, how to work the audience. And I remember one of our partners tried to explain to us. It said, rotate your hand the way you would rotate it when replacing a light bulb. Then you smile and then you move away. And I mean, we sort of, as part of a group, we could get away with it. You would not get away with bad choreo in a solo number. Mm-hmm. But of course, we had to properly learn all this later. I mean, in the beginning, it was extremely hard. Sometimes a colleague would ask, oh, did you see so-and-so in this row or that row, dressed in such and such? And please, I couldn't focus on anything other than the bar. I was so nervous and focused only on getting the job done as well as I could, as well as possible. Because working in a group is not like doing a solo. There are 4 high bars involved. If you make a mistake, you could harm and injure your partner. So the first 6 months, I used only my technical skills and I worked like a mule and I saw nothing around. I mean, it happened after a while. With experience, I started to relax, to look at the audience, to ask myself before every performance who they were, who my audience was, and who I was actually doing it for. And finding this why was important, because you did the same routine every day.
So my understanding is like you go through all the training, you like understand technically what you have to do as an athlete to execute. And then the way that you start to realize your audience and who's out there is just by being on stage for a long time. How do you train a performer to perform and not just execute?
Но это уже следующий этап. Первый этап — это, конечно, научиться поставить хорошую базу.
That's the next stage. The first step is undeniably to lay down the basics. Like in any discipline or subject, if the basics are strong, the student will progress nicely. Afterwards, when we do the tricks and the combinations and then we link them, I will go and find someone to come and teach my student choreography, as that just is not my competence. I can only express if I like what I see. Usually for all the festivals, I used to work with my wife, whom I consider the best choreographer. She's helped me with 14 festivals. And even if I didn't like something that I saw, I would only tell her like after the fact. I wouldn't dare interfere with her work because I trust her completely.
So how did you go from performer then to start coaching circus?
Вот отработав 5 лет в московском цирке.
So after 5 years of working in the Moscow Circus, I realized that I wanted to return to teaching. During one of my vacations, I went to see my former gymnastics coach in Moscow and asked him if I could go back to coaching. And he wondered why I wanted to return to gymnastics and shouldn't I maybe try teaching in the Circus Institute. I had no idea that place even existed or where it was. So actually, he made a call there and then. He obviously had connections in the place, or he knew who to call, just to inquire if maybe they needed a gymnastics coach. And the answer was immediately, yes, we are looking for one. So as soon as I returned to work, to the circus, and I told my supervisor that I would like to leave the group and the number, and I would find my own replacement and leave to teach at the Circus Institute. And he took it well, really well actually, and said that it was my life and I had to live it, and he let me go without any repercussions. And this was how I ended up at the Circus Institute. In the beginning, I was given years 1 and 2 groups, so a beginner's level of acrobatics. And we were 3 months away from the end of the teaching year when I joined. By the way, when you coach a group of students, you also work with 2 other coaches, you work together. So when I started introducing the technical basics of gymnastics jumps, the older circus coaches, and they were all over 60s and 70s, kept approaching me and asking not to bring and telling me not to bring my sports techniques into the circus school, like I was doing so much wrong. I tried to adapt for the 3 remaining months and attempted to work without actually being able to show my work. And so I decided to leave. There was no point in staying, as I was not really being listened to. But that was in the department of acrobatics. The institute, however, also had an aerial gymnastics department. A senior coach from there came up to me and asked if maybe I would consider joining the aerial discipline. And I was apprehensive. I didn't want to feel ignored at work anymore, but he's convinced me to give it a go, to try, since my background was in gymnastics and a high bar. So for the new teaching year, I transferred to a different gymnastics department.
But I'm confused, like, isn't a body and movement is movement? How is circus technique for these acrobatic coaches different than the technique you learned in the club?
Depends on what surface you do the jumps. In the circus, we jumped on sawdust, and that was super hard. In sports, we already had what we call ski trails. The platform wasn't made of wood. It was softer and gave you a little push. Like you wouldn't be able to do backward flips with a high amplitude on a hard surface because obviously you could tear the Achilles tendon. Sports is always the innovative one. It keeps moving forward with its techniques. In circus, the development is a little slower. We prefer to work with what we already know and have. We use a different approach. In the Circus Institute, I was the youngest of the teachers, and the other coaches were close to retiring, and the school was 30 years old. They were all surprised I came to work there and kept asking me why I would choose to teach there and did I not want to have a proper job first. But I just worked and tried to invent something new. The number I was involved in, its stage director, I mean, by then he had traveled the world, and unfortunately later became partial to alcohol. So due to his condition, we could no longer travel abroad. We weren't allowed. And if you stay in the country, you really just get to tour Siberia and the Far East, and it takes away from the motivation. The 5 years that I did work there were actually really good. I worked with well-known people, such as the illusionist Emil Kio. with whom we worked together for 2 years in the same program. I worked both on my own number and as his assistant, which is how I know a lot of circus magic tricks, tricks we had to sign actual NDAs for. Like, we knew them, but we were forbidden to talk about them. It was fascinating to work with Emil. We also got jobs at what we now call gyms. We earned twice our salary there. I mean, in those days, as a regular circus employee, I earned about 500 to 600 rubles a month. It would have been different if it had been my own solo number and I would have been the only one responsible for it. When you work in a group, the results depend on everyone involved. And if one person in the group has a reputation for drinking, the entire image of the group is tainted. So this was the Soviet Union, and touring and going abroad was not so simple. So I didn't see the point of further working there. It was a group number, and everyone worked together, but some strived to push further while others really weren't that interested. They pocketed the good money they earned and just went home to their families at the end of the day. Like, progress didn't interest them. I was the youngest in the group, and I wanted to try something of my own, like to coach a student who would be better and stronger than me. I mean, I myself had a coach who had helped me reach a certain level, but I was adamant I could do an even better job if I had my own student. I mean, I thought that there would be in the realm of gymnastics, but I'd never imagined I'd get into a circus institute. So a year after starting at the aerial gymnastics department, I was approached by Teresa Durova, who at the time worked as a choreographer. And so she came up to me and she pointed at a girl on a trapeze and just suggested I train her. I let her know that I'd never done this before. I had no idea what she meant or what she was talking about. To which Teresa just told me to go read some relevant books in the library and then try it in practice. The girl's name was Lena Panova.
Okay, quick note about Elena Panova and her novel Trapeze Act, because we don't really get into her that much in this interview, and she hasn't had her own interview on the Artist Athlete podcast quite yet, even though a lot of you have been asking for her, and we're working on it. And she is a total badass, and basically, the act that she created with Victor and Teresa Durova was the first of its kind, in that the trapeze swung back and forth throughout the entire act. It never just hung in one position statically, and it included full twists between the ropes, with Elena hanging from the bar and the ropes by her ankles in an ankle hang, and she would do half turns, which she would catch the bar with her heels. Another aspect that made the act so cutting edge, dare I say contemporary, was that the emphasis was on the quality of Elena's movement, not about the aspects of height and danger and thrill. The act won her a ton of awards, and she performed it all over the world. She now lives in San Francisco, where she is the head of the aerial department at the San Francisco Circus Center. Also, you can follow her on Instagram. No, I'm not kidding. She's elena.panova.trapeze. And yes, she is every bit the total babe you would expect her to be.
I know, Elena. Wow. Because, yeah, my understanding was like swinging trapeze was completely different before you and Elena Panova started working together.
Firstly, When I took her on, I was completely unfamiliar with the subject. Secondly, I had also found no relative books in the library. So when I started working with Lena, I had no knowledge of what I was doing. At the same time, I took on 4 more girls from the kids group. And so with them, I began to experiment. Lena had had quite a bit of experience by then. She had trained in a group on a high bar, and so she was familiar with the fundamentals. With the 4 younger girls, I was able to test all that was or was not going to be possible on the trapeze. I made mistakes, I went back, I analyzed them. But when something did work with the little ones, I would immediately go and try it with Lena. Since her level of preparation was higher, she was a lot quicker in grasping the new elements. Every 5 months in the Circus school, the Circus school does showcases. And when we tried to show the judges our tricks, they did not believe what we were doing was going to be possible. So I would actually get told off for asking Lena to even attempt them. And by the end of the final year, after we had perfected everything and presented it to the graduation examination board, we immediately, on the spot, got asked to take part in the World Junior competition. And at the same time, I was working on another student with a boy on a rope.
And no one had seen something like this before?
I hadn't seen it either. I mean, I had seen trapezes in action, so to speak, and I'd seen them in videos, but it all looked so static. It looked a lot less than what I felt was really possible on a trapeze. And it's one thing to do it on a longer you're doing it on, but Lena had been working on a local longer, which is this tiny cable tied to the trapeze. So whatever we had attempted to do on a single launch, we were told by the judges we would never pull off on this local launch, which is what we had to do. Though the tricks had been ready before her final year, before her graduation, during the final year, we needed to adapt them to the small launch. And the small launcher not only doesn't really help, it actually gets in the way. Its only job really is to prevent the gymnast from falling. Should you slip, this cable just pulls you back up and you hang off it. And I used to actually call it blue belt. And I made Lena fall on purpose. It was very painful until she got used to the feeling and was no longer scared to try things.
Have you ever tried swinging trapeze? I've heard you've never tried it.
What for? Everyone should do their job, should stick to their job.
Okay. So you don't think it's necessary to have done it to coach it?
If a coach has the ability to visualize teaching elements in aerial gymnastics, then you don't really need it. Did you know Nadia Comaneci's coach used to be a basketball player?
So do you think you could...
and then he transferred to gymnastics, and that became his passion. That isn't easy to imagine. But me, I'm from a gymnastics background. In fact, I know quite a few coaches who hadn't done trapeze in the past, though as a rule they are gymnasts.
I was going to ask if you think you can coach basketball.
I played football for 5 years before going into gymnastics, and I was good, so I think I would have been okay coaching in that field. I loved football actually, but not as much as gymnastics. So, no, there's nothing unique about my choice, it seems, and feels pretty natural to me.
Well, also because how could you develop things that never existed before?
No discipline starts with teaching or learning tricks. They all start with grasping the basics. It's kind of like the alphabet and how we learn it at school. When we first start learning the letters, A, B, C, and then we put them into syllables, then into words, then sentences. Like, it's the same thing here. If you miss one letter, then you won't be able to learn an element with that letter in it. So whichever student I start to work with, I start the exact same way. I make exceptions for the ones who come in with a possession of certain fundamentals already. And then I build on what they already know. So I work the same with everyone. I assess their level of ability and then decide how to proceed further. So really it depends on the student and their level of knowledge. In the past, all my students were beginners and we would start learning from scratch. These days, though, I get people who come after learning the trapeze and graduating from other schools. So they come to me to advance their level and I don't have to teach them the basics.
Yeah, but if you have someone like, Elena Panova or somebody who has already the fundamentals and you're working on an apparatus that never existed before, it's almost like you have to make up words. Do you know? Like you have the letters, you have the fundamentals, but there are times where like these skills didn't exist, right?
Every previous student is sort of like a stepping stone for the next one. I learn together with all my students. When I look at what my current student is doing in order to achieve results, it becomes the basis for what the next student could do. And this for me is always a massive learning process, and I learn together with every one of them, and that is why I and they progress. Every following student just does not repeat exactly what the previous one did. So there is no magic here, and it's only practice and time. And every student also has their own level to reach, which depends on the time and their physical ability, their character, and I guess their motivation.
Aside from like a physical foundation or that preparation, what other attributes do you think a artist needs to be very good at swinging trapeze?
For me, it's really important that the person love the trapeze, that they want to work with it. A swinging trapeze essentially is 2 ropes and an iron bar, and you keep hitting yourself on this iron bar, and that's really painful. The person who can overcome this obstacle is the one who truly wants to learn. That's highly important. Now I get students come to work with me and I see their attitude and I know they want to do this. But in the past, let's say in the Moscow Circus School, my students were all grouped and not everyone in those groups were equally keen on trapeze. So when they saw how painful it can get, especially at the start, where they would constantly be hitting themselves on that iron pole, even though of course we tried to soften it by wrapping layers of fabric around it. I mean, some students just refused to stay. So for me, firstly, it's the desire to work, the work ethic, the state of their minds. Work ethic, I think it's the most vital. I have had truly talented students who would learn everything super fast. And I also had students who would take longer to learn, but they had the most incredible work ethic. I've worked with students who were made for trapeze, like incredibly talented. But when the time would come to, repeating the same sequence again and again and again, they would just get tired. They'd get tired of it. And then I had students like Uwe, like Emma, and they were the ones who might not have grasped everything immediately, but their drive and a knack for repetition, it was just mind-blowing. They had no problem doing the sequences 100, 150 times in a row, and they would get better results than their more talented colleagues because they knew what it was like to work, and they felt a lot of joy about it. And at times they would even wear me down. I'd be like, "Oh, get off now. I'm tired from all of these repetitions." And she'd be like, "Okay, Victor, don't get wound up. Let me do this once more and it'll come out well this time." She ended up being one of the most incredible trapeze artists I've ever seen. So work ethic beats talent. This is Uwe Johnson. She had incredible stamina. She was the only one I would feel tired from working with. I never get tired from work, but I did with her. She just didn't stop. Honestly, if she could do a 100-kilometer ski race, she would win it. She could do her entire number 6 times straight in a row and without a break. So yes, so every student is unique. And as a coach, I treat everyone the same, but everyone is different, and I do bear that in mind.
You were in Moscow. You were with Elena Panova. You won at the Soviet Festival. You won at Cirque du Soleil, all these places. When did you come to Montreal?
If I am to tell the story about my moving to Montreal, I will have to start by telling you about my 2 years in Paris in the Annie Fratellini school.
Oh, you have to tell it then.
Because that was actually the start. And that's when, after working with 2 students in Paris and getting back home, I developed a completely different, like an assessment and a view of my own work. I realized I was in high demand, which was a surprise. I hadn't even known what to expect before going to the Paris Festival. We'd never taken part in any competitions. I was coaching 2 students. I mean, they were very well prepared for their age group, but I had no idea they would become so highly regarded in the world. So when I got back to Moscow, I had a better idea of what to do with my new students and how to do it. During the following 2 years, I coached a girl, Marina Golovinskaya, and when we came to Paris with her, she immediately got gold. And that's when Annie Fratellini approached me and talked to me about my coming maybe to Paris for the summer for temporary work. And the year prior, I had actually got married to one of my students, and we had a baby daughter, so we had a family. And we all temporarily uprooted just for the experience. We arrived on tourist visas, and really the motivation behind it for us was to see Paris, to see what the school was like. But I understood, of course, that there must have been something behind that invitation to Paris. And it was all nice when we landed. We had a transfer car. We were given a small caravan, actually the smallest living space I'd ever seen. And before coming to Paris, I would tell my wife how much she was going to love it, how wonderful everything will be there. But of course, what I had seen of Paris was during the festivals. And now we were living in this tiny caravan with no toilet, no amenities. That couldn't, of course, compare to the Paris I'd experienced during the festival. And my wife wasn't impressed. But what mattered was that we met with other coaches, and Miss Fratellini introduced me to 2 of her students and asked me to work with them. And I agreed, but I warned her that we couldn't stay long as my wife had to go back to her studies and finish her final year at the Moscow Circus Institute. When we were in Paris, it was during my wife's, let's call it a gap year, because she should have graduated by then, but hadn't due to a back injury. So I began working with Fratellini's 2 students, and my wife at the time was also my trapeze student. And I remember we were having like this big dinner, and I approached Miss Fratellini and I asked if she maybe wanted to look at my wife work the trapeze, and she was quite surprised and said, well, can she do it? And so I replied, well, you can see for yourself. And so upon seeing my wife's trapeze number, Miss Fratellini hired her on the spot for their Paris tour. But we were in Paris on tourist visas for 6 months. And I had to raise my concerns with Annie. Like, how can we go on tour if our visas are about to expire? And somehow she took care of it. Honestly, she seemed to know everybody and anybody, everywhere and anywhere in France. So she got our visas extended for us. We worked the entire tour with Miss Annie. During one of the performances during the World Circus of Tomorrow Festival, its director was in attendance and he saw my wife on the trapeze and declared that that was the number he wanted to have in his program, to compete with it for the Fratellini School, as that's where the number was created. So that meant my wife would be representing France. And I had to clarify that, but yes, since the number was created in the Fratellini School, we would have had to represent that school. So Fratellini invited a stage director, Valentin Gnevyshev, if you know him, so he could help us finalize and polish it. But suddenly what happened was like a Russian delegation decided to meddle and protest against our performing for a French school, since my wife and I were from the Soviet Union. And so it became quite obvious we must not attend. But the festival's director, he retaliated by stating that he will disqualify the entire Soviet team if we weren't allowed to take part. So the delegation conceded and they went along with those terms, but they arranged a meeting with me separately and they warned me that I was to have, a proper conversation with them once I'm back home in Russia. So my wife took silver, representing a French school at the festival, whilst I was being warned to, get ready for repercussions. And as our current visas were expiring, we had to fly back home and wait for another invitation to come back to Paris for work. But as turned out, there was another option where we went to the French prefecture and got our current visas extended for a second time, like for another 6 months, which in total allowed us to stay in Paris for a whole year. So for that extra year that I managed to stay in Paris, I kept working with those 2 students, which had resulted in their winning a French championship. And after that, not much could have been done. By law, another visa extension wasn't possible, and we would have had to go back to Russia. And I warned Miss Fratellini that, it was a given. Should I return home, I was never going to be able to come back because we had represented a French team.
What were they going to do to you when you got back to Russia?
No, I don't think I would have been considered as an actual traitor to my own country, but representing another country's team would have had caused problems on a legal level. And with repercussions like those, you would never be able to travel abroad again. And that was the Soviet Union, and those were the rules. So we would have been classified as morally unstable. So that's when one of my French students suggested that why don't I try going and working in Canada. The entire Canada knows you from the festivals, she said. And then she offered to help find who to call and to talk to. And so together we called the Circus school there. She translated for me, as I unfortunately never got around learning French properly. And I only spoke the basics that I was using during, my lessons. And everything I needed to know for the training sessions was head, shoulders, arms, legs. So we called the school and suddenly I just heard, when can you fly over? So I replied, as soon as the visas are ready. A month after that, we received our work permits at the Canadian Embassy and we could go to Montreal. Miss Fratellini was not at all happy, and I had to explain the situation to her in detail. And then she asked me just to at least think of somebody I could replace myself with. And so I nominated my friend, Alexander Dubrovsky, my former colleague, we used to work together, who's now been working at the Fratellini School for 27 years. Also, what had happened was 2 weeks before our leave for Canada, Jean St. Croix from Cirque du Soleil arrived in Paris, and he arrived especially for me. So there are 2 trapeze numbers in Alegria and their coach had left for another school in France. His name was André Simard, and he was an exceptional coach and my competitor in the best sense of the word. Thanks to our professional rivalry, trapeze numbers kept progressing. He was the first to use the launcher we were only allowed to use at rehearsals. And so he made it acceptable to use it during actual work. His student, Henri Page, worked on it at one of the competitions, and the launcher got accepted for the performance, and not just rehearsals. In the Soviet Union, we were not allowed to use that launcher. It was only for rehearsals. So this was like a really big deal, having it accepted. Working with that type of launcher meant a completely different, security system, completely different tricks. And if the launcher was accepted at a world festival, then it would just become a regular launcher. From there onwards, I worked only with that type of launcher. Like my first 4 numbers were with a cable, but after that, I'd only use this type of launcher.
Victor describes lunging pretty well, but just in case y'all are confused, when a swinging trapeze artist is up on the trapeze, the lunge is the cable that someone on the ground, Victor in these cases, is holding for safety. Usually in a performance, this is one single line, so think like Peter Pan style, except for instead of helping the artists fly up in the sky, the lunge keeps people from falling or hitting their teeth on the trapeze bar because the metal bar is really heavy and dental work is expensive.
So when Monsieur St. Croix came and told me he wanted me at Cirque du Soleil, I had to decline, as I'd already had an arrangement with the Circus school. So he tempted me with double the salary, but I can't. I gave my word, I said. And he told me not to worry and that he would deal with it. And he had. When we arrived in Montreal, I began working in 2 places simultaneously, Cirque du Soleil in the mornings and the Circus school in the afternoons. And that's how I began working with 2 trapezes, for Alegria and at the school. And after 6 months of working in Cirque du Soleil, where we were already preparing the program, an invitation came to take our double trapeze back to the Paris Festival. I mean, they were not my own students. Technically, they had been André Simard's students, and I only worked with them for the past 6 months. But in Paris, it actually ended up being both André and me who were their launchers. Because remember, he had moved to work in France, and he held the girl, Carolina, and I held the boy, Xavier. So this was the start of my work in Canada, and it has been 27 years.
I don't want to skip over this important distinction, though, of the launch fixed to the trapeze bar versus pulling, because I do know this was a really big thing in the trapeze world to change. And what I think the argument is that it no longer is the technique of the artist, but the ability of the langer to do the work.
Well, these are 2 completely different types of work, because the students who worked on a local launcher, they had more injuries. When you drop or fall into this launcher, you can't be aimless about it. You have to fix and secure yourself just in time. Or you can break a rib, or you can even break a spine. So it's more injury-inducing than the launger that we work with. Secondly, the local launger restricted the students during certain tricks. You could only do tricks in descent with it. So when you were falling, it doesn't protect you on the ascent. During an ascent, that launch offers zero security. It only holds you in case of a fall. It's all it does. So the other launcher lets you do much more impressive tricks and effective tricks. But it requires a launger for the artist, which is why when I work with a gymnast, I try to work with a launger at the same time. So much depends on them, not only to make sure that the artist doesn't get injured, but also that the launger doesn't get in their way. The problem with a lot of laungers is that they get in the way during tricks if they don't understand the technique or if they don't understand how it works. So I always talk them through everything, where to stand, what to do. It is time consuming and it takes at least a week or two. But then I've got my peace of mind knowing that my artist is working with a well-prepared launger. I'm most scared of laungers who dismiss my explanations with like this irritated, oh, I already know all this. I don't know all this. So I have to try and relay how much responsibility being a launger carries. Like a person's life is in their hands.
Yeah, I guess that's my question is, at what point does it become the launger doing the trick for the artist? You know, like I think about like hand balancers, if they're doing one arm, you have a coach who's like holding them, right? But at some point the coach goes away. With a launger, you always have a launger, yeah? So are there tricks that the launger can do with the artist that they couldn't do alone?
They need to hold a launger a little stretched. If you don't hold it, it will sag and that will disturb the artist. So it has to be a little stretched at all times. There are elements during which an experienced launger can help out the artist a little bit. That is true. But it is way more important that they just don't get in the way by, for example, pulling the string at the wrong place. Like most of the time, I am just holding the rope, and it's only when the tricks begin that I start to observe what is required of me. And if a person is doing something wrong, I must catch them immediately and not, 2 seconds later, because 2 seconds later, if they are making a mistake, they will have hit themselves on the trapeze. So this is highly visual biomechanics.
So how do you know when to let the student fall and when to save them? And I'm thinking particularly like in a festival where like if you know that you can pull a little bit because they didn't quite do what they needed to do, but you could get them around, is it more important that the trick happen or that the artist do the trick?
But that's what the launger's work entails. I personally can predict when something is about to go wrong just by seeing the change in the artist's speed of movement. I just see it. It's visual work for me. During like falling, descending sequences, the launger doesn't do much. They just give the rope a tiny stretch to prevent it from twisting. But during the rising sequences, if the launger is late and the artist misses that pole, then he or she would keep flying up towards the trapeze until they reach and hit that bar with their body or their head. So if the launger misses that crucial moment, the artist will be injured for sure. So when I'm preparing a launger for 2 or 3 weeks, say before their performance, and then they tour together with the artist, it's usually problem-free. And the problem is when the artist arrives alone and looks for a launger themselves, and then the risk is high. And it's lucky if the launger happens to have a gymnastics background, because they would understand the technique better. Otherwise, an injury risk is super high. You need to be extra careful. It's basically a duet. Yes, it has to be the most synchronized duet, and the artist has to trust their launger.
Just a couple more questions. So you train a lot of young people, especially at ENC, at the National Circus School. Do you see your job outside of just the technical training, like for these kids? Do you give them any life advice or any kind of outside coaching?
Firstly, I don't work with children. There are no children in my school. Even I've got this one girl as an exception, but she only works belts with me. And as a rule, I work with adults. And when I'm with my students, I like to joke around. And they all know now that if I'm joking about, then everything is going well, and that something is wrong when I look serious. It's very rare that I would have to stimulate someone to work. When I worked in the Moscow Circus School, I was also being a class teacher, sort of like a supervisor to my 20 students. So I had 10 girls and 10 boys aged 16, 17, and I organized meetings for them. I took them to excursions. I was in charge of that one class. And I dedicated my time off work to them, as that was part of my job. And this isn't how it works here in the Canadian school, which is fine, because then I wouldn't have any free time. And, I mustn't forget I've got my family. And yes, my wife sometimes asks me if my students come first before the family. So I ask her not to joke even about that.
I feel like people have gotten so good on swinging trapeze that there's got to be a point at which you can't make any more rotations or flips. Like, what moving forward does the discipline offer the circus world?
Well, I believe the trapeze will always have a future because it's got a big swing. And when a gymnast manages to achieve like a massive swing, then the audience, especially if there are school children in it, they all scream in delight because they think it's possible to fly off. And swinging happens to be one of the trapeze's basics. So, and this is what I teach my students. They just have to sway as far as possible. And I noticed new different tricks appearing these days, and they are complicated and really interesting. And yes, so I think the trapeze will always have a future. And did you know that the emblem of the Soviet circus used to be a trapeze? Yeah. Did you know that? Yes, Moscow Circus is famous for having so many disciplines.
Cool.
But the one chosen for the emblem was a trapeze. It's just a visually satisfying discipline.
Final question. What advice would you give to yourself at the beginning of your career? So like when you were the junior coach in the Moscow Circus School and everyone was like, you're like, be quiet and push you off to the side. Like, what would you say to yourself back then?
I know one can't go back to the past, but if I could and start it all over, knowing what I know and with my experience, well, that'd be something. But such is the nature of life. To get this experience, you're meant to make mistakes along the way. And there was no one helping me at the time, really. And so I was meant to do everything I have done and to have walked the path that I've walked to arrive to where I am now with all this knowledge. On the one hand, I'm so happy that people from all over the world seek me out to work with me. But on the other hand, I am a little disappointed that there is no professional competition. Because competition is what pushes you forward. It's progress.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, why not? Like, why is there no one who's as good at teaching swinging trapeze as you are?
Yes, Alexander Dubrovsky. He has prepared 2 exceptional students, but he doesn't have his own school. So he doesn't have the numbers of students that I have, from which he could choose the best ones and then work with them. Like, his school doesn't operate like that. When a teaching year starts and if no one has applied for trapeze, then there's no trapeze classes.
So he needs his own school for you to have competition. Victor, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Спасибо.
Конечно. Пожалуйста.
Of course, not a problem. You're very welcome.
Если это вам было интересно.
I hope you found it interesting.
And that was my interview with Victor Fomine. Thank you, Victor, for coming on the podcast. It was an honor to have you. And thank you out there to all of my friends who have supported me along the way to 100 episodes, my fans who have become Patreons at patreon.com/theartistathlete and have written me and tell me to keep going when I wanted to stop making this podcast. And thank you to the foes. I loved in Victor's interview when he said that one of the things he thinks is a shame is that he has no competition right now. There's no one else who's really working at the same level as him. And I thought that was so funny and such a perfect way of kind of explaining how I see foes. I see foes as the people out there in the world who are working so much harder than me and doing so much better than me at podcasting, at their own circus performing, at teaching, at living their lives. And I look up to them and they push me to be better every day. So thank you to my foes. More thank yous for this episode. Allison Castonguay, you are my amazing sound editor. Thank you for all of the late night Instagram DMs, voice messages I've left you. Hannah Osayanka is my incredible assistant. Marina Kedrova and Marina Antonova are the two Russian translators. The on-site recording was done by Irina Kozak, and additional research for this episode is from articles by Guy Maria Akil, the European Federation of Professional Circus Schools, and, of course, Wikipedia. For more training tips and inspiration, you can follow me on Instagram. I'm at _artist_athlete. My website is The Artist Athlete. And if you love what you're listening to and you want to support it each and every week, patreon.com/theartistathlete is the place. Talk at you next week, friends, fans, and foes. The Artist Athlete podcast is supported solely by donations from people like you. Here's what some of those people have to say.
Hi, I'm Freya. You can hear my whole story in episode 50 of the Artist Athlete podcast, but I'm here to tell you about something else that I do. I'm a qualified health and nutrition coach. I help people with sleep and body confidence, among other things. You can see everything I have to offer at wildguidance.com or follow me on Instagram at wildguidance.
Hi everyone, I'm Dominique, a ground acrobat, trapeze artist, and coach, currently bringing circus to the extremely cold but very beautiful Northern Ontario, Canada. Circus has changed my life and I'm so grateful to everyone in this community. Find me on Instagram at DomUpsideDown or my website domupsidedown.com.
Hi everyone, this is Allie Cooper, owner and coach at the Radical Movement Factory in Santa Cruz, California. I love supporting the Artist Athlete podcast and the amazing community Shannon has created here. I teach rope and fabric and have a circus conditioning app available on iTunes called Cirque Plus. You can follow me on Instagram at AllieCooper_, and if you find yourself in California, come say hi.
Hi, I'm Leah. I hate conditioning. So I created the ABCs of Fitness, a fun, full program of active flexibility, body weight, and cardio with personal daily check-ins to motivate you wherever you are and whatever discipline you do. Join our next 19-day check-in challenge and slide into my DMs on Instagram at ABCs of Fitness.
Aloha! My name is Beth Russell, and I live on the beautiful island of Maui, Hawaii. I am an aerial artist and movement instructor specializing in chakra yoga to keep me balanced and grounded. I play with silks, trapeze, lyra, rope, acro, aerial yoga and dance, slacklining, pole, bungee, and climbing. Really anything that goes up and allows me to explore 3D space. You can find my dedicated aerial page on Instagram at Maui Aerialist. If you find yourself coming to Maui, let's play.
Hey there, friends, fans, and enemies. This is Chris Alston, Patreon of the Artist Athlete podcast, straps artist and lyra performer and acrobat out of Greenville, South Carolina. So if you're ever passing through, make sure to stop in and see me and my friends. We have a wonderful space, and we'd love to see you.
Hi, my name is Erica Lee. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, and I'm an aerialist. I teach performing arts to elementary school during the day and do pole and swing and rope by night. I really like the Artist Athlete podcast because it gives me a lot of circus goals to look forward to. It gives me a lot of insight on what's going on around the world in circus, and that's why I'm Patreon.
Hello all. Thank you for tuning in to the Artist Athlete podcast. I am Opal Schwartz from Minneapolis, Minnesota. If you're ever in the cities, feel free to stop by the Aviary Minneapolis. It's a great time. With that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your week, and goodbye.
Hey there, artists and athletes. This is Andy Smith, owner and artistic director at Saltaire Circus School in Jacksonville Beach, Florida. And I want to thank you for contributing to the Artist Athlete podcast. If you ever find yourself down in Florida, come check us out. Whether you're an artist, athlete, or someone ordinary just looking to be extraordinary, we have a place for you.